History often celebrates the big names, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. But sometimes the most powerful stories belong to those who lived in the shadows, nearly erased from memory. One such story takes us back to June 17, 1775, to the Battle of Bunker Hill. The air was thick with smoke, cannons thundered in the distance, and British soldiers in gleaming red coats advanced up the hill in disciplined formation. On the colonial side, farmers, craftsmen, and laborers stood behind makeshift earthworks, short on ammunition but not on determination. Among them was a man whose very presence defied the logic of his age, Peter Salem. Only months earlier, Salem had been enslaved in Massachusetts, his body and labor owned by another man. Freedom was not his birthright, it had to be fought for. Yet now he stood with a musket in his hands, fighting for a cause that promised liberty to others, but not yet to him. The irony could not have been sharper. White colonists cried for freedom from British tyranny even while keeping men like Salem in bondage. As the battle raged, one figure stood out on the British side, Major John Pitcairn, a seasoned officer infamous among colonists for his role at Lexington, where the first shots of the Revolution were fired. Pitcairn shouted orders, urging his men forward against the colonial defenses. At that moment, Peter Salem steadied his musket, took careful aim and fired. His shot struck Pitcairn in the chest, ending his life instantly. That single musket ball carried more weight than anyone on that hill could have imagined. It was not just the death of a British officer. It was proof that a man once enslaved could shape the destiny of a nation. In that moment, Peter Salem forced America to confront the contradiction at its core, fighting for liberty while denying it to those who bled for the cause. To understand Peter Salem's extraordinary act at Bunker Hill, we need to step back to the beginning of his life. Born around 1750 in Framingham, Massachusetts, Salem's earliest years were marked not by freedom or opportunity, but by slavery. He was owned by Jeremiah Belknap, a white farmer who viewed him not as a human being but as property, something to be bought, sold, or discarded like livestock. For nearly 25 years, Salem's time, labor, and even his name belonged to someone else. Yet Massachusetts was not the Deep South. Slavery in New England looked different from the vast plantations of Virginia or South Carolina. Enslaved people here often lived in smaller households, working directly alongside their owners on family farms or in urban trades. This did not make slavery humane. Salem was still denied autonomy, dignity, and basic rights, but it created unusual spaces of interaction. Some enslaved people learned to read and write, sometimes even gaining a Christian education, since Puritan ministers preached that all souls were equal before God, even if society refused to honor that truth in daily life. This contradiction, preaching spiritual equality while practicing social inequality, was the world Salem grew up in. Massachusetts in the mid-1700s was already wrestling with moral debates about slavery. Enlightenment thinkers questioned whether human bondage could coexist with ideals of natural rights, while religious leaders began to ask whether slavery truly reflected Christian values. Still, the law remained firm. Salem was not free. And yet, within this environment of hypocrisy and half-measures, something else was happening. By growing up in a society where enslaved men sometimes gained literacy, military training, and exposure to revolutionary ideas, Salem absorbed tools that would later allow him to rise above the limits imposed on him. His early life was defined by chains, but also by contradictions that would set the stage for his transformation into a soldier, a marksman, and an unlikely hero of the Revolution.
Buite 1760s aan 1770s, Peter Salem leef in a Massachusetts boiling with the unrest. Wete kolonists comply net of buying enslaaf het by Britann's taxes and laughs, uit die ironie was sharp, men woe of net iemand buying spoke about liberty with a passionate conviction. Salem still enslaaf het, witness het tes contradiction verstand. He wilt have yard about the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765, which uitdrag het kolonists wo veldtuig voites weer ignoreerd by parlement. He mag het have listening to debates about the Townsend Acts and the almost certainly yard whispers of the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when rebels disguised as Native Americans dumped tea into the harbor. Perhaps most powerful of all, Salem kneef the story of the Boston Massacre in 1770, when British soldiers fled into a croft, killing 5, including Crispus attacks, a man of African and Native descent. Attacks bekame ter first martyr of ter revolution, a powerful reminder that men of color stood at the front lines of America's fight for liberty. For Salem, the hypocrisy must have been instable. Colonists claimed that taxation without representation reduced them to slavery. They ignored the literal chains that bound thousands of African Americans across New England. The contradiction was not only noticed by enslaved people. British writer Samuel Johnson van Mousley mocked American patriots by asking, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" Still, for Salem, these rising tensions offered more than ironie, they offered possibility. Waarmee disruption? Waarmee neef choices? If the colonies rebelled, the desperate need for soldiers made finally open doors for black men to fight. And with the fighting came the chance, hoe we verslim, for freedom. For Peter Salem, revolution was not just about independence from Britain, it was about testing whether America's promises of liberty sold ever etten to him. The year 1775 forced Peter Salem into a decision that would change his life. On April 19, the first shots of the American Revolution rang out at Lexington and Concord. British troops marched to seize colonial weapons, only to be met by determined militia. Some weer in the chaos, the sought yard round the world was verred. Among the British officers present was Major John Pitcairn, the same man who would later fall to Salem's musket at Bunker Hill. For Salem, this moment was more than distant news, it was a signal that history was shifting. The battles created a dilemma for enslaved people across New England. Should they remain with their masters, hoping that stability would protect them? Or should they gamble everything by joining on the side of the conflict, risking their lives in exchange for uncertain promises of freedom? The British were the first to make an offer. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, terwijl gouverneur of Virginia, issued a proclamation, aan een enslaved persoon who fled a patriot master and joined the British forces wild geen freedom. To many, it was a chance for the talking, touched me and alligning with the teverij empire that had protected slavery for generations. On the American side, things were merkier. Colonists cried for liberty, but at first, black men were barred from enlisting in militias. That politiek ran into reality waar het manpower. Slowly, colonial leaders began to accept African Americans into their ranks. In Salem's case, his master, Jeremiah Belknap, my half freed him specifically so that he felt enlist, a decision motivated as much by profit and quotas as by principle. For Salem, the choice was both dangerous and deeply personal. He chose to fight alongside the colonists. With the freedom nearly granted and a musket in hand, he stepped into a waar his courage felt reverite not only his life, but the vermeaning of American liberty.
When Peter Salem enlisted in the Massachusetts militia in 1775, he crossed a boundary few African Americans were permitted to cross. He became a soldier in the fight for liberty. For the first time he was no one's property. He stood among free men taking an oath to the patriot cause. But the weight on his shoulders was heavier than most. As a black man in uniform, every action, every shot, every moment of bravery or fear would be judged not only as his own, but as a reflection of his entire race. Training was basic but intense. Colonial militias had little of the polish of the British regular army. Soldiers drilled in loading and firing their muskets, marching in formation and holding the line. Yet militias relied as much on grit and local knowledge as on discipline. The musket Salem carried was likely a Brown Bess, a smoothbore flintlock effective only at short range. Accuracy required practice, patience, and steady nerves. Salem proved himself a skilled marksman, perhaps drawing on experience hunting while enslaved. His regiment included farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. For many white men, serving alongside black soldiers was a new and unsettling experience. Some accepted their African American comrades as fellow patriots, recognizing shared courage. Others grumbled, believing their presence lowered the honor of service. Yet on the field, prejudice had to bend to necessity. When bullets flew, bravery mattered more than skin color. For Salem, the pressure to excel was immense. A single mistake could reinforce racist assumptions, but excellence could open doors for others like him. He carried not just his musket, but the unspoken burden of proving African Americans worthy of freedom. As he prepared for battle, Peter Salem was no longer a nameless slave. He was a soldier of the Revolution, about to earn his place in history. By June 1775, Boston was under siege. Colonial militias surrounded the city, while British forces held it tightly, supplied only through the harbor. Both sides knew that the high ground across the Charles River, the hills of Charlestown, would determine the balance of power. Whoever controlled Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill could rain cannon fire onto Boston and its harbor. On the night of June 16, Peter Salem marched with about 1,200 colonial soldiers under Colonel William Prescott. In silence, they crossed Charlestown Neck and climbed Breed's Hill. Their mission was urgent and dangerous: build fortifications before dawn. Armed with picks, shovels, and determination, they worked through the night, piling earth into defensive walls. Salem and his comrades dug while keeping one eye on the harbor, where British warships could spot them at any moment. The labor was exhausting. Dirt stained their hands, sweat soaked their clothes, and every shovel of earth carried the weight of survival. If the British discovered them too soon, the colonials could be slaughtered before the fort was ready. But the men persisted, driven by the knowledge that they were building not just defenses, but a statement. The colonies would not back down. When the sun rose on June 17, the British awoke to a shocking sight. Fortifications crowned Breed's Hill, bristling with militia ready to fight. Outraged, British commanders prepared an assault. Across the harbor, Salem could see their ships shifting into position, gunports opening, cannons ready to thunder. On the Boston shore, thousands of red-coated soldiers assembled, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun. For Salem, it must have been terrifying and exhilarating. He had spent the night transforming a hill into a fortress. Now he would have to defend it. As the British advanced, Peter Salem prepared not just to fight for America, but to prove that freedom was worth dying for. June 17, 1775. The blazing sun bore down on Charlestown as British troops began their advance. From his position inside the crude earthworks on Breed's Hill, Peter Salem watched one of the most disciplined armies in the world march toward him. Drums beat in perfect rhythm, bayonets flashed in the sunlight, and red-coated soldiers advanced in neat lines. To the colonials, many of them farmers and tradesmen, the sight must have been both magnificent and terrifying. The order had been given: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Ammunition was scarce and every shot had to count. Salem and his comrades held their ground, hearts pounding, muskets ready. At 50 yards, close enough to see the determination on British faces, the colonials unleashed their first volley. The effect was devastating. Dozens of redcoats fell at once, their neat lines shattered. Survivors staggered, regrouped, and retreated down the hill. Against all odds, the farmers had stopped the Empire's finest. A second assault followed. British commanders adjusted their approach, using artillery and tighter formations. Again, the militia held fire until the last possible moment. Again, a deadly volley ripped through British ranks, cutting down soldiers and officers alike. The hill shook with smoke and thunder, but the colonials stood firm. Still, their greatest weakness loomed: powder and shot were running out. Every man knew the third assault might break them. Exhaustion, fear, and desperation clung to the defenders. Yet their determination did not waver. For Peter Salem, the moment was deeply symbolic. He was fighting not only for a new nation but for his right to exist as a free man. Each musket shot was defiance. Each volley was proof that courage was not bound by race or station. The revolution was alive in every heartbeat, every trigger pulled. The third British assault was brutal. Learning from their earlier failures, commanders concentrated their forces and pressed forward with grim determination. Colonial defenders, low on ammunition, had little left to resist with. Many clutched rocks or bayonets, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. It was in this desperate moment that Peter Salem seized his chance. Among the British leading the charge was Major John Pitcairn, the officer long remembered for his role at Lexington, where colonial blood had first been spilled. Pitcairn, mounted and shouting commands, was a clear target. To colonial eyes, he embodied British arrogance and tyranny. For Salem, aiming at him meant more than strategy, it was justice. Through smoke and chaos, Salem steadied his musket. The world must have seemed to pause as he squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, cutting through the noise of battle. Pitcairn fell, struck in the chest. The sight rippled across the battlefield. British troops lost one of their most capable officers at the very moment their momentum mattered most. Confusion spread, morale faltered, and the attack staggered. For the colonials, Salem's shot was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol. A man who had once been enslaved, a man society deemed inferior, had struck down a feared British officer with skill and precision. His courage proved false every claim that black men lacked bravery or discipline. That musket ball carried not just lead, but a challenge to the very foundations of racial hierarchy. Though the colonists eventually retreated when their ammunition ran dry, the cost for the British was staggering. Over 1,000 casualties, many of them officers. The victory felt like defeat. And in the heart of that bloody day, Peter Salem's perfect shot stood as both a military and moral turning point. In the immediate aftermath of Bunker Hill, Peter Salem was celebrated by some of his white comrades. Officers acknowledged his role in killing Major Pitcairn, and his name appeared in reports of the battle. For a brief moment, recognition seemed possible. Here was living proof that African Americans could fight with skill, courage, and loyalty equal to any white soldier. His story was used by advocates to argue that black men deserved a place in the Continental Army. But celebration was short-lived. The revolution was built on contradictions. Liberty for some, slavery for others. While white heroes like Dr. Joseph Warren, who died at Bunker Hill, were immortalized in statues and textbooks, Salem's story began to fade. For many leaders, acknowledging black contributions raised uncomfortable questions. If African Americans had fought and bled for independence, how could the new nation justify denying them freedom and citizenship? Silence became easier than recognition. Still, Salem kept fighting. He continued to serve in the Continental Army, participating in campaigns at Saratoga and beyond. His loyalty to the cause never wavered, even as the country he defended failed to honor him fully. Thousands of black patriots shared his fate, serving with distinction only to be erased from the narrative. This erasure was not accidental. It was deliberate. By minimizing black contributions, white society preserved its myths of superiority and avoided confronting the hypocrisy of a revolution that declared, "All men are created equal," while treating some men as property. Peter Salem stood at the center of this contradiction. He was a hero, but a hero whose legacy was buried to protect the nation's fragile self-image. His courage lived in the memories of those who fought beside him, but history books turned their gaze elsewhere. His story reminds us that America's founding was never as simple or as equal as we are taught to believe. After the revolution ended, Peter Salem's life reflected the bitter irony of America's founding. He had fought bravely in some of the war's most important battles, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, yet when peace came, the promises of liberty did not reach him fully. Salem settled in Leicester, Massachusetts, where he worked as a cane weaver, crafting chair seats for a modest living. It was skilled work, but far from the honor or security one might expect for a war hero. Like many veterans, Salem struggled with poverty. Revolutionary pensions were often delayed or denied, and for black veterans, racial prejudice added even more barriers. While white heroes received land grants, statues, and a place in America's story, Salem slipped into obscurity. By the time of his death in 1816, he was living in a poorhouse in Framingham, the same town where he had been born into slavery. The man who had fired one of the most consequential shots of the Revolution died in poverty, his name barely remembered. But history cannot erase truth forever. Salem's story resurfaced centuries later, thanks to historians and civil rights activists determined to recover the voices of black patriots. His courage at Bunker Hill became a symbol of resilience and equality, proof that African Americans had always been part of the nation's fight for freedom. Today his name stands alongside others like Crispus Attucks and Salem Poor, men whose sacrifices force us to confront the unfinished work of liberty. Peter Salem's legacy is more than a tale of one shot or one battle. It is a mirror reflecting America's contradictions and aspirations. He reminds us that the revolution was never fought by one race or one class, but by a diverse people struggling toward a promise of freedom. His life demands we remember that liberty is hollow if it is not for all.